Hey everybody, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and on today's episode we are going to be reassembling a differential. I'm going to show you guys how to do that, and I'm going to show you guys how to install it on a Classic Mini gearbox. So stay tuned for that. All right, so as I mentioned on today's episode, we are going to be reassembling this Cooper-esque gearbox and really getting it kind of buttoned up and ready to go. But specifically the task we're going to be tackling today is reassembling properly a single pin differential, and we're going to be installing it and setting the preload for the roller bearings, the actual carrier bearings that hold it into the back of the gearbox. Now, this is something that can be done and is pretty much universal across all the different lines of Classic Minis, but you may see some variance in the differential itself. In this one, it's an early A-series differential cage. Later on, they introduced a few changes to that single pin differential. And then there, of course, is the aftermarket upgrade to do a cross pin differential. That is 2 pins and a much stronger differential. Now, we won't be doing that one today, but if you guys want to go back through some of my older videos, I have a cross pin differential assembly video. I will link that in the top right of this video now. But let's get into how to assemble this differential, because it's actually not that difficult. It's a pretty easy job. So hop over to my brand new workbench and I'll show you guys how it works. Now let's go over the parts that you're going to need for a diff rebuild. Now, what you see here is a crown wheel. This is a crown wheel to suit the pinion gear. That's the gear that goes onto the end of the main shaft inside the gearbox. These must match, so you must have a mated pair between the two of them. And really specifically, it must be the same ratio. Now, this is your final drive gear, and this is what determines your RPMs at any specific speed when you're driving your car. So a larger number, like a 3.4 or a 3.2, is going to have a higher RPM at a higher speed. So to put that in perspective, a 3.4 might have, 6,500 RPM at 70 miles an hour. I'm just making these numbers up for the sake of this video, but might have 6,500 RPM at 70 miles per hour. Now, if you change that final drive gear up to a smaller number, so maybe a 2.95 final drive gear, you might be able to reduce those RPMs down to 5,500 at 70 miles per hour. Now, I have a really cool calculator. I spent a lot of time building that on my website. That'll show you every detail you need when choosing a final drive gear for your car and your engine. It'll show you the speed at various RPM, and it'll show you the speed at which you kind of have to get off the line. It's all very, very valuable information, especially when you're building a gearbox to suit exactly what you want. Now, crown wheel, go ahead and set that off to the side here. Next up, we have the actual pin that goes across the differential. So this is your drive cage right here, and you can see it has a hole on the side of it there. This is where this pin slides through. And this pin holds your 2 planetary gears, if you're going with a single pin diff, inside that differential and allows them to spin freely. Now, it's really, really important. There are a few different pins you can get for a Classic Mini. All of the ones that you get from Mini Spares at this point or any other parts supplier are going to be uprated. At this point in time, it's really unusual for you to find one that isn't uprated with a nicer style metal. And the reason that is because if you take a look at this one right here, this is actually what came out of the Cooper S. Now, the reason that is you can see this one that came out of the Cooper S literally has grooves ironed down and driven down into the single pin. This is basically a totally failed single pin diff. And this is where you see the failures happening in most of these differentials to begin with. what happens is you're sending all of that power through a single pin. So literally all the power of your engine is going through this pin, and these were not made with very good metal. You even can see these are supposed to be like wear surfaces to oil the planetary gears, but really it did not work that well. So moving on to the upgraded ones. There are two different kinds you can get now. This one right here, which is a standard differential planetary gear single pin. And the reason I mention all of this is that this pin right here is made to work with the original planetary gears that do not have bronze bushings inside them. So you can see these planetary gears right here have no bushing inside them. They are perfect metal, just inside and out. Now there's a really nice kit that you can get, which unfortunately is out of stock basically everywhere in the world, it feels like. And that one has these planetary gears with bronze bushings inside them, but the single pin that goes through it is a different kind of metal, and it's super important that you don't mix and match these. If you are using standard differential planetary gears, you're going to want to get the standard uprated pin. If you are using the ones with bronze bushings, you're going to want to get the pin to suit that, which I believe is, well, I can't remember the name of the metal, but I'll put the links to those in my description below. Next up, you have two planetary gear bushings. These are copper, pretty straightforward. I'll show you guys how those go in a minute. And then you have your center support. This goes in between the two planetary gears that helps hold them against the sides of the differential and keeps them from working their way inside to the inner part of the differential. Now, the last couple things that you will need are thrust washers. And these thrust washers, I'm going to go over these in a minute. There are a few different kinds that were available, and we have an opportunity to use some of the original ones. This is your crown wheel bolts right here. You can actually get ARP versions of these, but the factory ones are actually very good. These are your lock tabs. These go underneath your crown wheel bolts, but I also use Loctite on these now. It's just much better than only using and relying on these tabs. And then finally, you have your carrier bearings. These are made specifically, and I strongly recommend getting RHP ones. These are made to hold the differential in place on the back side of your gearbox. So you'll need two of those. And then of course, the last thing you'll need are your Driveshaft outputs. Now these can be swapped out when you're building up one of these differentials. These are the early style output shafts. So this actually has a coupler, a rubber or metal and a nylon coupler that comes off of the end of this and gets mounted on. This is what was actually originally on this Cooper S, or a factory upgrade was the Hardy Spicer joints. Unfortunately, I don't have a set of those to show you. And then there is a different style output for CV joints that can be swapped out and used instead if you want to upgrade your car to CVs. For example, my Mini, I upgraded to CV joints specifically because they were stronger and they were much easier to service, and they would handle the turbo power a lot better. These are going to be great for an NA engine, so if you have these right now, there's nothing to worry about. But if you wanted to upgrade to something more modern down the road, you can do that when you're building out your differential like this. Now, first things first, we take our differential drive cage here and want to make sure, just do a slight inspection on it, make sure that there is no damage to it. In this case, this one is in great shape. There's no damage, no wear, and it's going to work perfectly for our Cooper S. Now, we're going to take one of the output shafts. They are the same, and the washers I was talking about before, this is something really cool I wanted to mention. Earlier output shafts used literal metal copper bushings. These would go down here, and that's what would provide the wear surface between the output shaft and the differential. Later on, they started adopting a cheaper alternative, these fiber thrust washers. I'm not really sure what kind of fiber it is, but it is definitely not metal anymore. They are perfectly fine. This is what I run in my car, and this is what they are replaced with moving forward. But if you have a set of these copper ones, this is what I would definitely use instead. This is going to be a lot more robust, and it's going to last much longer. So we'll go ahead and set that down here. Go ahead and install it on the other one as well. There we go. As with anything, I like to go ahead and add a little bit of lubrication whenever I'm going to install something new. This is obviously inside the gearbox, which means it's going to be literally submerged in oil. So you don't have to fuss on it too much, and you don't have to worry about it too much. But you know, having a little bit of oil there on initial startup is, you know, desirable. So we take our first output shaft and we go ahead and put that in there. Now there is a bronze bushing in there, and this is really important. You're going to want to check to make sure that with this set down here on the drive cage, that there's not excessive play in that bronze bushing, because that's going to translate to slop in the differential and it's going to cause premature wear. Now, with that out of the way, I think what we're going to have to do is move over to our bench vise. It's going to show you guys this a little bit better than I can on this table. All right, now on to installing the planetary gears themselves. These bushings always need to be replaced when you're rebuilding one of these. In theory, you could probably get away with a set of old ones, but personally, I like to just replace them, make sure that everything in the gearbox and inside the differential is new. Now, you might find that one side works a little bit better than the other, and in our case, this left side fits a little bit better to start off, and you can see that moves nice and free in there. Now, I put my bushing in. Next up, we're gonna put our actual planetary gear in, and you gotta kind of rock that into place. Got planetary gear number 1 in. Next up, we are going to put our actual retainer in place, just like that. And you might find this can be a little finicky. Might have to put the bushing in over here first, hold your gear in place. This is one of those situations where as many hands as you have can help you line up all this stuff and get it fit nice and perfect. There we go. There we go. And once you have that pin in place, it should be pretty much flush on both sides. All you have to do now is verify your hole right here is straight through, and we're going to drive down a lock pin in those. Now you might find there are 2 different kinds of locking pins. This one is an original one. It's a solid one, so there's no opening down the middle of this. I'm not going to reuse this one because it has some wear on it, but the replacement ones are split pins like this, and we're going to drive this right down in place. Just need to make sure we get it all lined up. Now with that in place, your differential is actually pretty much assembled. You can see here when you spin the drive shaft on the other side, you have your single pins and they're operating really nicely. Now, the way that this works is you set your other drive gear in here, and that'll be kind of loose like that. That's actually quite normal. Don't forget the thrust washer if you haven't already installed it. And then the next step is, of course, to put the crown wheel itself on. Now, there's only really one way that this will go on nicely, but I'm going to show you guys exactly which way that is. You'll have a taper up here that is going to go out. Go ahead and slide this on down. And sometimes you might find it's easier to install, there we go, the drive gear and the output shaft on the crown wheel. And we'll rotate that around until our holes line up. Now the spec for this is 60 foot-pounds. Remember, it's extremely important that this gets torqued to the proper spec because this has all of the power of your car being driven through it. So just keep that in mind while you're building this. It's a very important piece of machinery inside your engine. Now all these holes are equidistant apart, but I usually like to leave the actual stamping of the gear visible, only because if there's ever a person in the future who takes apart this gearbox and says, you know, what differential is in here? Which one, which final drive do I have? They will easily be able to see that number and they might not have to take apart the whole thing. You know, always think about the person who's doing this in the future because it very well could be you. All right, with those in place, I would recommend swapping the differential around so that you are holding the pin side of the differential. It's a really good place to hold it to actually tighten this down here. So to tighten this down, we're going to do a crisscross pattern. So here, 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 something like that. You want to do a star pattern, just make it even. And again, we're going down to 60 foot-pounds. All right. Now with all that torque down, we're going to bring these lock tabs up. That's kind of a pesky part. And then with that, we'll actually be able to move it over to the gearbox and start setting our preload. Now I mentioned that we can move back over to the gearbox, but I actually want to use this bench vise to also install our differential carrier bearings. So each of these bearings is uniform. You're going to want to check them to make sure they're nice and smooth before putting them on. And the way I like to do this is line this up in the bench vise. Go ahead and set that nice and flat. And for this, I like to use a larger socket to kind of hammer down the center. In a perfect world, we would have a hydraulic press, but I don't have enough room in my shop for that. All right, carrier bearing number 1 installed. We're going to flip this over and we're going to do the same thing on the other side. All right, now with the carrier bearings installed, we can move this back over to the gearbox. All right, so moving on to the next part, we are going to need to install our differential and set the preload. That is the amount of load on the sides of your differential in the space of the gearbox here. So to do that, we're going to take our brand new differential and we are going to lower it in. There's only really one way this can go in, and it gets lowered in and mated with the gear on your main shaft. And you can see, and probably hear, the gears are running real nice. Sits down there nice and pretty. Give it a little tippity tap. Now, the way that I like to do this is to set and install one of your output covers on the side here. Now this goes on just like this, and the reason we do that is we're going to shim up one side of the differential, and I'll bring you guys over here in just a minute to show you how to do that. But we're going to be using shims, these little metal shims. These can be reused as long as they're not broken from a previous gearbox build. I strongly recommend keeping those. They come in a variety of different sizes and thicknesses, so keeping a stock of those is definitely advisable. We are going to install this output cover via 2 gears, via 2 bolts on the side, but we also need to install the gasket. We can install that dry. That's going to inform our total amount of preload, and this is a zero tolerance game here. And no, I don't actually mean, a war on drugs. What I'm actually talking about is the clearance between the diff carrier bearing on this side over here and the space between that and this output cover. You don't want it to be pinched in place. You want it to be zero tolerance, so no space, but also not squeezing. And I'll show you guys how to do that. Now with our gasket in place, we're going to go ahead and lift this up and screw it in, and we're actually going to tighten this all the way down because we need that full pinching force to actually set the preload correctly. Also, for this output cover and for anything that goes into the gearbox, I would recommend using a manual tool. I would not use any power tools on these. The casing is made out of aluminum and it tends to strip really easily, and specifically these output cover holes, they seem to be the #1 place that it strips on this gearbox. So just something to keep in mind. It'll make your gearbox life a lot easier, and it will prevent you from having to do any sort of thread repair, which is definitely really a pain in the butt if you've never had to do that before. All right, so that is fully cinched down. We've got it pinched in. Now let's flop over to the other side and I'm going to show you guys how to set this preload. Now to start off, I usually just hold up my diff output cover just to see if we make full contact with the differential itself. And I don't think that I think we're gonna need some shims here. And that is the space between this inner race right here and the face of this differential. That's what you're setting the preload in. And I'm gonna grab some of the nicer looking shims I have. We'll just take 2 of them, set them in place. And this can be kind of an annoying thing to do too, just gonna warn you. As you can see, those shims like to fall down. Now, let's go ahead and put a couple bolts in here and check our preload. Now, unfortunately, I've just noticed that I have run out of my fresh, clean grade 8 bolts. So we're gonna use this bolt right here to set the preload here and, check our measurements. But we're gonna have to get some nicer bolts for this build because, we want this to look really fresh and nice. Thankfully, we will have the same tolerance whether or not we have pretty or not pretty bolts. All right, now with that fully in place, let's go ahead and check the space in between our gears here, in between the shim. So you can kind of see that there. Now let's take our feeler and see what we can get in between. Hopefully we don't have anything in between and my shim is correct. Otherwise we're gonna have to take it off and recheck it. Yeah, so you can see I've actually got, oh, that post is in the way. So you can see I've actually got a feeler down in between those shims and the output cover. And what that means is that there is too much space there. So we're gonna have to take this cover back off, and then we're gonna add a shim and then retest. And it's really just this, back and forth, over and over, until you get the correct shimming. Now, as I mentioned before, it's very important that the shims themselves are properly seated up against the retainer of the output cover, because they can actually get pinched down in there and not do their job properly. So you're gonna always wanna make sure that they're properly seated, nothing has fallen down or gotten smushed. Almost zero. So we've got definitely a lot more space, or a lot less space in there. Let's figure out exactly how much we need. Now, as you can imagine, having lots of shims in there can be kind of a pain in the butt. And I would recommend putting your thicker shims on the outside. It'll help you kind of hold things in place more easily. Also, if you can, using simply less shims that are thicker is going to be, in general, a lot more desirable and a lot easier to set up. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of really thick shims, and the preload on this is actually, we need a little bit more than I've had to use in the past. And there we have it, a perfectly shimmed gearbox. Now, this is, you're gonna wanna just double check to make sure that it spins pretty freely. Right now it is in gear. It's in first gear in my case. So with that, you are able to put on your output cover on the back here. All right, so now that we have the shim and preload set properly, we are going to need to install these with some permanence. And what that means is that, well, we need to get our gasket sealer out, because this is one of the best places for you to put gasket sealer on your car, specifically on these output cover gaskets. These are notorious for leaking, and it's something that is totally worth doing and putting a little bit of glob on here when you put these on. Now, in addition to that, there are two gaskets, one on each side of this face here, and then this cover is gonna come right down on top, and we're gonna bolt it all in place with some brand new grade 8, really high quality nuts and bolts. All right, and what I like to do here is test fit these to make sure that you are putting the right gasket on the right side. Just get it all lined up. All right, so the gaskets that I put on first are the ones that go on the actual gearbox for the whole cover to go down on. This is just the easiest ones I find to start off with. Keep in mind, you don't need to use a boatload of gasket sealer. You just want to put a little bit, a little glob on it, because if you put too much on, you can affect the preload of the shims that you actually just set up. So it's something to keep in mind. I literally just put a really light smattering on here, and then slide that down over all of these studs. One thing you might find is that these gaskets protrude a little bit on the sides of the output cover. If that happens to you, just take a small little box cutter and cut off the excess. You don't want that excess to stick out, because it's going to prevent the output covers from sealing properly. It's super simple to do. Yeah, just take a little box cutter or a safety knife or anything like that and shave off the excess. And that's just on the sides with the output covers. The rest of the sides should be fine, but worth checking everywhere. Right. There we go. Give that a little hand tap in place. And then what I like to do is take a rubber mallet and just drive it that little bit of the way extra home. Now, I don't tighten those bolts down just yet, and there's a reason for that. And that is so that I can line up the holes on these output covers. So I start with the side without any shims, just because it's easier. We can start off there. And I, of course, put a little bit more gasket sealer on my output cover gasket. Put that on my output cover, just like that. And we will slide that in place. Now for these, I always use spring washers. I don't over tighten these. It's really important that you don't over tighten them. But I also have started to get in the habit of putting a little bit of blue Loctite on it. Don't use red, it's too much for this. But having a little bit of blue on there helps these from walking themselves out while the engine is vibrating and, operating and all of those different things. So we're gonna get these in place here. Now you can also see why I suggested to go ahead and put these in loose, or at least a little bit hand tight, before the cover goes all the way down, because all of these holes on this cover actually will shift down a little bit as it gets tightened down. So you want everything in place exactly where it needs to be before you cinch everything down. It just makes everything a lot easier. All right, so with that side in place, we're gonna do the exact same thing on the other side, but keep in mind this is the side with your shims, so don't forget to put those back into place before you put that output cover back in and cinch it down. All right, with all of those cinched into place, all we gotta do now is put the stud nuts on the tops of this output cover, and we are pretty much done. Pretty exciting stuff. Now there's only two real things left for this part of the gearbox, specifically the diff cover. One is installing the rubber seals for the output shafts here. Those are gonna go in, as well as the output shafts themselves. The actual coupling flanges themselves, I'm gonna go ahead and install those. And then we're gonna install the shift linkage that is used on this remote gearbox. And then the gearbox itself will be done. And then moving on into the next episodes, we'll talk about end float for the idler gear and getting that all set up for installing it on the engine. So I'm gonna go ahead and push this in here, and it's a pretty straightforward process. You can kind of push it in by hand to get it initially seated, and then take a socket that's the same size, and we're just gonna drive that in. All right, so there's only two things left really to finish off this remote change gearbox. First, we're gonna go ahead and put the output shafts, or rather the output flanges on. These go into these output shafts here, and they kind of should just slide into place. You might need to get a little rubber mallet. All right, and there we go. So those are in place, and this is a great time to also verify that your gearbox is spinning over nice and smooth, as you can see. Now, you'll be able to spin these independent of each other. That means your differential is working. But if you want to verify that your gearbox spins, you can go ahead and put both, and that will spin the actual crown wheel in a direction. You can try going the other way as well. Everything is spinning really nicely, really easy, which means that we're in good shape here. Now, one bit that I added off camera was this little grease nipple right here. This greases the selector shaft that goes through here and connects your selector up here to the selector, and then ultimately your gear change down here. Now this is the next part that we're gonna have to tackle, and it's a pretty easy one. It's nothing too complicated, but you have this shaft that looks something like this, kind of weird looking shaft, and then you have your actual like pivot unit right here. Now you can see one side of this has a curve, one side is straight. The straight goes down, so you'll be taking the curved end, and that'll be popping out here. Now, to make this nice and tight with no slop, what you're gonna be using is a cotter pin shaft here. There's two holes on each side with for your cotter pin to go in. And what we're gonna do is slide this in place here. Now, before we actually push it through the selector itself, we are gonna grab a rubber washer, and that is gonna go on one side here. And then we're gonna do the same thing on the other side. And this is all to kind of decrease chatter. Make sure your gearbox and gear selectors don't sound like, a bag of bones when you're shifting and driving down the road. Granted, the Mini is just loud in general, so it's gonna be loud no matter what. All right, so the last thing that we're gonna do is put two washers, one on the outside of each of these cotter pins here. This will sit down and hold that nice and tight. And then I always grab new cotter pins for this job. There's no reason to reuse the old ones, especially if you're rebuilding a gearbox. Usually those are going to be pretty rusty. So make sure you find a cotter pin that fits nicely. Doesn't have to be enormous, but you want it to be the right size for the application here. And these cotter pins are bent up just like any other cotter pin. Rotate it around here and bend them up so that they hold in place, or just flip them around so they fall out. So the last thing that you're gonna do is slide your selector shaft up through the hole in the bottom here. It is going to mate with this selector fork at the bottom. As you push that up, you'll see it starts coming out the top here. And this is going to require a pivot shaft. So this one has teeth inside it, and there's a notch cut out right here. And a bolt's gonna go through here and locate into this. So the best way to do this is to kind of slide this down in place and check to make sure that that lines up. And crazy enough, that actually lined up perfectly. So I can get this bolt through here. Now, by setting this bolt in here, just hand tight, now it can't fall out, which is pretty annoying when you're putting this together. Now, the next one is, of course, this top shaft right here. We have another selector fork, little doodad here. What we're gonna do is also do the exact same thing. I would recommend kind of setting that down in there. And actually, before we do that, let's make sure to put a little bit of grease in there. Now, it doesn't have to be any special high temperature grease or anything. We just want something to add a little lubrication onto this. And we will set this down in place. Let's hope we lined them up. Ooh, first try, amazing. All right, we'll tighten this sucker down. Now with that in place, I'm actually gonna disconnect this one real quick, make sure to support it on the bottom end. And I just want to add a lock washer to this. I don't think these actually will walk out that much, but everywhere you can add a lock washer that isn't, aluminum casing is probably a good idea. We just want this stuff to be extra. We want this stuff to be extra reliable, and we just don't want it to come loose on the car because this is the kind of stuff that's really hard to service once it's in the car. This is basically impossible to reach. It's funny because this grease fitting right here, I'll be able to grease it right now, and I'll do that before we do everything up. But there's no way to reach down there and grease this while it's in the car. The exhaust is over this. There's just tons of stuff in the way. Now, something I did not mention is this is a bronze bushing inside your selector housing here. If there's a ton of play in this shaft right here, that bronze bushing probably needs to be replaced unless you're just okay with slop in your shifter. But all of this added up, slop here, slop there, slop at the bottom, all of that slop is going to translate to poor shifting, and we don't want that. And there we have it. A shifter ready to be used and ready to be used on your car. Now, it's kind of hard to do by hand. You probably won't be able to, and that's totally fine to select gears. But what you will be able to probably do is if you have your shifter assembly, you should be able to hook it up if you really want to test it out and test all of the shifting linkages. But in reality, if you're trying to shift it into gear up at the top with like a pry bar, it's pretty much the same thing. Now, the last thing I want to mention is the nuts, the castle nuts on the end of your drive shafts here. Those need to go on before this goes back in the car. So I go ahead and put this washer on here. And this is a place that I like to use thread locker. It's got a cotter pin on here as a safety, but just adding a little thread locker is a little bit of peace of mind, which is nice. And you'll notice this has a cotter pin hole. It's something I forgot to mention earlier, but when you put these output shafts on, if you have a flange type like this, you are gonna want to line up that hole. Otherwise, you're not gonna be able to get the cotter pin in, and it's really annoying. So just something to keep in mind when you're building up your gearbox. All right, ladies and gentlemen, there we have it, a fully assembled Classic Mini 3 Synchro Cooper S gearbox with straight cut gears and a 3.4 differential. Now with this wrapped up, what that means is we can move on to the top end and start assembling the engine. But this was a really cool gearbox and a really unusual setup that I got to work on. I think it was a lot of fun. It had its own challenges throughout the build, which you guys have seen already. But if you have any questions whatsoever about this build, about this gearbox, assembling a remote shift gearbox, anything like that, feel free to post those in the comment section below, and I will do my best to answer those questions for you, or at least direct you into the places that you need to go. A few things I didn't cover in this episode were things like setting the idler gear float. That'll be done later on, and I'm not sure that I'm gonna cover that since I have a whole separate video on how to set that idler gear in float. And I have a full rebuild series. If you want to see that stuff, you can check that out. The link should be popping up in the corner. But thank you guys so much for tuning in to this episode, and we are getting into the home stretch, so it's super exciting stuff, and before long, we're probably going to be starting this engine up. So until I see you guys on the next episode, you know the drill. Enjoy those minis, and motor on.